Good evening and welcome to a Wednesday night edition of Tysky Sour. We are going live as MPs are debating a pretty shoddy plan to raise national insurance to pay for social care, or some of it anyway. To discuss everything that's wrong with this policy, I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm doing good. I'd like to wish Bernard Sanders a happy 80th birthday. Young and sprightly as ever. But yeah, no, I'm doing really good.
Oh my God, he's 8. My mind is completely blown by that fact. That is incredible. As I said, we're going live as MPs are debating it. There have been some, it kind of reminds me of those debates during the Brexit period when you had no idea which way the vote was going to go. This time it seems pretty certain that Boris Johnson is going to get this through on this reading. So we're not going to speculate so much about who's going to vote for it, who's going to vote against it. We're going to talk about the substance of the policy. We also have coming up for you Gavin Williamson's biggest gaffe yet. It's a racist gaffe. Maybe gaffe isn't quite the right word. Let's go straight on to our first story. MPs are currently debating Boris Johnson's manifesto-breaking plans to hike national insurance by 1.25% to help pay for the costs of social care. The plans, which would cap care costs in England at £86,000, have been promoted by the Prime Minister as a necessary fix to problems which have beset social care funding for decades. Keir Starmer has said the manner of raising the money is unfair and that the plan doesn't fulfil Boris Johnson's promise that no one would have to sell their home to pay for care. The two leaders battled it out today at Prime Minister's questions.
His plan is to impose unfair taxes on working people. My plan is to ensure those with the broadest shoulders pay their fair share. I know they don't like that debate. The truth is, his plans don't do what he claims. People will still face huge bills. Many homeowners will need to sell their homes. He's not denying it when he could have done. And the Prime Minister has failed the only test he set for himself for social care. It was in the manifesto. Another manifesto promise, Prime Minister. No good shaking your head. And who's going to pay for the cost of this failure? Working people. Under his plan, a landlord renting out dozens of properties won't pay a penny more, but their tenants in work will face tax rises of hundreds of pounds a year. A care worker earning the minimum wage doesn't get a pay rise under this plan, but does get a tax rise. In what world is that fair?
Mr. Speaker, actually the Institute for Fiscal Studies has confirmed that this is a broad-based and progressive measure. The top 20% of households by income will pay 40 times what the poorest 20% pay. The top 14% pay half of the entire levy. Now, Mr. Speaker, he talks about his plan. Well, actually, it turns out I've been scouring the records for evidence of the Labour plan. And I found it, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, the current Shadow Secretary of State for Social Care joined forces with Nick Bowles and Norman Lamb to promote a new dedicated health and social care tax, Mr. Speaker, based on national insurance. The current, where is she? I can't see her in her place, Mr. Speaker. And she said this was to be the country's beverage moment. Well, is the Labour Party really going to vote against the new beverage moment tonight?
Mr. Speaker, let me tell you what an ambitious young member for Henley said in 2002 in this House. What he said in this House: national insurance increases are regressive. I wonder what happened to him.
You saw in that exchange lots of claims and counterclaims as to whether or not rises to national insurance are progressive or regressive. Boris Johnson was claiming they are progressive. He'll probably be pointing to statistics such as this. You can see here from a BBC graphic from the government website that it will be the case that people on the highest incomes will be paying the most towards social care from this new tax. People earning £100,000 will be paying an extra £1,130. That's compared to people on £20,000 a year paying an extra £130. However, that's not what makes a tax progressive. A progressive tax means that the wealthy should pay a higher rate of tax, not a higher total amount of tax. And on those terms, national insurance is as regressive as taxes come. We can make the point by comparing national insurance to income tax. Income tax is progressive. The higher the rate of income, the higher the rate of tax you pay. As you can see here, you get a personal allowance. Anything earned up to £12,570 is not taxed at all. Then anything between that figure and £50,000 is taxed at 20%. Above that, 40%. And then above £150,000, 45%. And that's what a progressive tax looks like. National insurance is the complete opposite. For national insurance, above a very low minimum, the more you earn, the lower the rate you pay. These are the rates of national insurance paid by employees in the current tax year. So there you've got that tax allowance before. So people earning below 9.5k, there's no national insurance for those wages. Then up to £50,000, it's 12%. But then once you get over £50,000, suddenly the rate of national insurance plummets to 2%. That's what a regressive tax looks like. And you can see the effect of this. You can see how income tax is progressive and national insurance is regressive with one more graphic from the BBC. So you can see here how income tax, the more you earn, the higher proportion of your income you end up paying in taxes. Whereas national insurance, once you get over £50,000, basically, you stop paying any extra national insurance at all, or only 2p to the pound, as you just saw there. Andrew Fisher, a former Corbyn advisor, in fact, former head of policy at the Labour Party, he put the significance of all this very well in a tweet today. He shared a Telegraph headline saying that Britain now has the highest tax rates since the Second World War. This is the big news line which has come out from this announcement from Boris Johnson. Fisher critiqued that headline, saying, "This needs context. Some taxes like VAT are at record highs and others have gone up sharply, e.g. council tax. But corporation tax was 52% when I was born. It's now 19%. That same year, the top rate of income tax was 83%. It's now 45%, and only for the top 1%. Who pays matters." And this is exactly right. We often talk about left-wing people, they want higher taxes. Right-wing people, they want lower taxes. There is some truth to that. I mean, left-wing people tend to be committed to more spending on social programs. But the important thing that papers over is that people with different politics support different taxes. What you will often see is people on the right, they want regressive taxes, taxes like VAT and national insurance. People on the left, they want progressive taxes, income tax, even a wealth tax. Now, one thing that's probably not talked enough about in politics in this country is how we have dramatically switched from taxes being progressive to regressive. We can take you through some of the taxes that Andrew Fisher mentioned and how they have changed over time. First is VAT, so value added tax. This is a tax on purchases. Rich people and poor people pay the same rate, so it's currently 20%. And as poor people spend a higher proportion of their income than rich people do, obviously poor people can't afford to hoard it, it means that it will ultimately make a bigger dent in their incomes. We can see here VAT rates over time, and you can see how this regressive tax has increased over time. Before Thatcher came to power, VAT was 8%. In 1979, she hiked it to 15%, and then in 1991, John Major put it up to 17.5%. That stayed the same under New Labour until the financial crisis when Gordon Brown dropped it to 15%, and then George Osborne came in and hiked it to 20%. So, why did that regressive tax get hiked? Why did they decide to dramatically increase VAT? Well, it was to pay for tax cuts for the rich and tax cuts for corporations. This is corporation tax over the last 25 years. So as you can see in 1995, there it's 33%. Under Tony Blair, it goes down to 30%. And under Brown, to 28%. From 2010, the Tories gradually lower it all the way to 19%. We can go even further back to the 1980s, and the difference is more stark. So in the early 1980s, before Thatcher started slashing it, corporation taxes were above 50%. Now let's look at income tax. That's the classic progressive tax. This has shown a very, very similar pattern. So in 1945, the top rate of income tax was 98%. That drops to 89% in the 1950s under the Conservatives. Labour put it up to 98% in the late 1970s. You can see that both very high rates. This is the post-war consensus. Both Labour and the Tories support high progressive tax. That all changes. You're probably seeing the pattern here. That all changes under Thatcher, when it more than halves to 40%. In the last 40 years, regressive taxes like VAT and national insurance have gone up. Progressive taxes like corporation tax and income tax have gone down. Dalia, I want to get your thoughts on this. I don't usually spend too much time thinking about tax rates. It's quite a wonky topic. But looking at all of this morning, I got pretty irate. Taxes used to be progressive. They're now regressive. This, to me, looks a bit like a scam.
Yeah, I mean, the scam is, I guess, neoliberalism itself. Like, neoliberalism is essentially a program of redistributing the wealth and risk of, economic activity from the already rich to sort of the ever expanding poor. That phrase, privatize the gains and socialize the losses, that's not a popular phrase for no reason. It's because it really accurately describes how our economic system is designed, and the tax system is part of that. But another way in which this is actually really classically neoliberal is that it's once again an example of a moment of crisis being used to entrench neoliberalism in itself. We all know that concept of the shock doctrine, and this is a perfect shock doctrine example in terms of the response to COVID-19. We have a poorly managed pandemic that prioritizes the needs of, the commercial and hospitality businesses over what is actually needed for public health. So, that means the premature opening of bars and restaurants and clubs without adequate precautions. It also means, vital services being outsourced to private companies that are schmoozy with the government, who essentially hoard those government funds and then put out a substandard service. So then what happens as a result of that is we have to repeatedly go these very draconian, strict lockdowns for longer periods of time than other comparative sizes and economies. That results in overwhelming the NHS, overwhelming the care system, creating these immense backlogs, which, I know that this is being marketed as a kind of social care levy, but actually the majority of the funds for the first few years, at least, are going to go towards filling up the backlogs created by these very restrictive lockdowns, which have happened increasingly because of mismanagement of the pandemic, which leads us to have to go to that last resort option. So you have this backlog where people can't go into hospital to get their regular checkups, their treatments. That is compounded by 10 years of neoliberal austerity, which is already pushing these health and care systems to the brink. So that means the government can then declare a crisis of the NHS. That means we need to have this significant financial injection. We all need to tighten our belts in order to fix that backlog created by the crisis. And that bailout, essentially, that financial injection, becomes a way in which the government can entrench the policies that it has always been invested in under the guise of unforeseen crisis management. So in this case, it's about protecting the asset wealth of the rich, whilst making working class people pay a disproportionately high cost for a crisis that they didn't create. So it is a scam, but it's actually not a new scam. It's the logic that has always underpinned neoliberalism. And I think that it's a continuation, especially of the kinds of logics that we saw under, post-2008 Tory austerity, which is a crisis has happened. It's come out of nowhere. We all need to get together and tie up and pinch our budgets and, tighten our belts and all contribute what we need to contribute to, when really we're all paying very, very different prices for that crisis. And our public infrastructure, which we are supposed to be saving through these bailouts, are actually staying gutted, essentially. So then what we have and what we're going to see as a result of this is, despite this being something that is meant to help our social care and healthcare infrastructures, what it's actually going to do is push people who can afford it into private alternatives as the public provision of services continues to not be at the standard that they should be. And then people who can't afford it, whose disposable income is going to be even more strapped by the increase in this tax, which will disproportionately affect them, are going to be pushed into increasingly predatory and exploitative systems of debt as they try to make up the money to top up from what are still going to be inadequate social care and public infrastructures. So it's essentially the story of the broader scam of neoliberalism, just in a COVID-19 friendly package, essentially.
I mean, I hope, together we've both explained well why this increase to national insurance is not a particularly fair move. It's regressive compared to the other taxes that they could have increased, be that income tax or be that a wealth tax, be that corporation tax. Now, earlier in the week and on Monday, we were discussing the fact that even despite this, national insurance did seem pretty popular among the public. It was more popular than income tax. And many people thought this move by the Tory government was very fair. In fact, the Tories seemed pretty confident when polls suggested support for their plans to increase national insurance were popular. However, the tide of public opinion seems to be turning on this. Opinion research today shows the public now oppose the Tories' social care plans. Overall, the public opposed the social care plan by 45% to 33%. Now, Conservative voters do support it. This is a Tory policy, and also they are probably potentially the people who are going to disproportionately benefit from it, older homeowners. Labour supporters massively against these social care plans. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there is also a very significant breakdown when it comes to age. So as you can see here, 18 to 34-year-olds, very, very against these plans. 55% think they're unfair. Only 29% think they're fair. Very similar figures there for people who are 35 to 54. And then it's only once you get to people above 55, we don't know where the cutoff point is because these are very broad categories, there is overall support. Although very tight, I don't think that's the kind of numbers that the Conservative Party are going to be looking at and feeling especially reassured. You might be asking then, why do we have a government who is increasing regressive taxes instead of progressive ones? The public don't think they're particularly fair. They don't make much economic sense, given that we have terrible inequality in this country, and it's not particularly good for general economic indicators. It's better for poorer people to have disposable income because they're going to go out and spend money on the high streets. If you give tax breaks to the rich, they just sit on it. They just hoard it. Well, we almost did have a government who introduced hikes to progressive taxes instead of regressive ones. This is from the Labour Party's 2019 manifesto. So in their manifesto, they wrote, "We'll ask those who earn more than £80,000 a year to pay a little more income tax while freezing national insurance and income tax rates for everyone else." That to me looks like a sensible policy, but it led to some pretty wild responses at the time. Let's take a look at this infamous moment from Question Time during the 2019 election.
I'd like to call out Labour as liars. I am one of them people that he will tax more, and I am nowhere near in the top 5%. So I'm calling you a liar right now. That 5% is a lie, right? I am nowhere near that. And you are going to income tax me as an employee. You're not going after the billionaires, you're going after the employees, where it's easy money because it's PAYE. I have no choice.
And that's just not, I'm afraid on that you're mistaken. We're not going to raise income tax for anybody apart from the top 5% of earners.
I am not in the top 5% of earners.
So we're not going to increase your income tax?
But you are, because I've read your policy. It's above £80,000. And I am nowhere near in the top 5%, let me tell you. I'm not even in the top 50%.
And that's why we're not going to increase your income tax. And
So hang on, let's just be clear. So you're suggesting you would raise income tax on those earning over £80,000. You're saying that would affect you because you earn over that sum?
Yes.
So you earn over £8,000?
Yes, and I'm not in the top 5%.
I think that is the top 5%, isn't it?
I'm not. Every doctor in this country earns more than that. Every doctor, every accountant, every solicitor earns more than that. That's not 5%.
I mean, it's not true that every solicitor in the country earns more than £8,000. When I was a solicitor, I earned just over £40,000 a year. The fact is...
So let's just be clear.
Yeah.
Just let's settle this once and for all. Well, certainly let's hear from you. If you earn over £80,000, are you in the top 5%? Yeah. Categorically?
Yeah, so the top 5% of earners will pay more income tax. And I think it's right that
top
those...
5%,
I think it's right
the top
those,
5%
I think that
don't even work. Because they're rich, right? So they don't even pay. They're not employees.
The richest of all people are the billionaires. A third of the billionaires donated to the Conservative Party. The other thing is, we need to say the enemy of somebody who's on £70,000 or £80,000 a year isn't someone on £20,000 or £25,000 a year. The problem is that a billionaire, for example, and we're told these people are wealth creators. The average wage in this country, would take 30,000 years of working the average wage in this country to get £1 billion. And that would be if you didn't spend a single penny. The people getting away with murder, in reality, are the billionaires. And it's the billionaires that back the Conservative Party.
That man in the audience speaking to Richard Bergen was wrong. He was categorically wrong. If he earns more than £80,000, he is in the top 5%. In fact, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, he's in the top 3% of earners in the UK population. Yet, when Labour put forward a policy to tax the rich instead of taxing disproportionately people on lower incomes, they were completely attacked and destroyed for it. Dalia, why is the politics of tax in Britain so intensely out of step with reality?
I mean, it's by that way by design. You know, the tax system is not here to do what we are told a tax system is there to do, which is to raise funds so that we can have public infrastructure that is widely accessible, that is high quality, and everyone pitches in according to, you know, what they have. But actually what the tax system that we have now is there to do, actually keep that wealth stagnant in the hands of the already rich, while squeezing the poor of every single dime they have, causing them to either fall into poverty or to incur, you know, greater and greater amounts of debt. And that's all done while those very services and public infrastructures that we are told our taxes are going towards are essentially, you know, decreasing in quality and availability. But our tax, and the way that our tax system does this is essentially by punishing those whose money comes from actually working and privileging those whose money comes from assets, inheritance, capital gains, dividends, which are sources of income or wealth that are taxed very, very lightly. It's basically class war in its most sort of classic sense, which has progressively come with the neoliberalization of our economy. So this is kind of the latest stage in this. And we have to understand that this really isn't about what makes financial sense. It's much more about architecting a particular system of power, politically, economically, and socially. You know, if capital gains were taxed in the way that income is, we would raise £90 billion of extra revenue over 5 years. This plan of the national insurance increase will raise £12 billion in 1 year. So that's £60 billion over 5 years. So this was truly actually about, you know, raising the funds that we need to salvage our social care system, which is a disgrace, and to raise those funds in the most efficient, effective, and equitable way possible. Then this taxes, we would be looking at a very different tax system. And the way that you design a tax system to to do this is through shifting around what sources of what sources of income and wealth are taxed the most. So this is really about reproducing and intensifying existing inequalities. It has nothing to do with actually resolving them. And this is why we have this fracturing between, what we are told taxes do, what we are told our tax system should do, and what it actually is being designed to do. And that's why, at the beginning of the show, you talked about how can be quite confusing, because in general, on the left, we look at taxes and we're like, that's a good thing because we are raising revenue to fund public infrastructures, and it should be done in a way that is proportional to how much you have. But by basically obfuscating what sources of by moving around what sources of wealth are taxed, you can actually have that do the opposite effect. And obviously that tax system is designed by politicians, so they are the ones that are primarily accountable. But we also have to remember the role that is played by the media here in obfuscating what a fair tax system would look like. Over the past several decades, we have had a huge amount of resources thrown into painting the very idea of taxing unearned wealth, of taxing the rich, as some kind of, unacceptable, unhinged concept. And this brings to mind the sort of several years long work done by the Taxpayers Alliance, which is a very small, esoteric think tank that has one very clear ambition, which is to lobby against any kind of meaningful and effective tax increase that would affect the wealthiest people, by creating this concept of the taxpayer, which kind of, in a similar way to like nationalism, sort of binds people who have very, very, very different material realities into this overarching identity that makes it seem like they both have the same interests, when actually they have very opposing interests. So despite being a very small, esoteric, specific think tank with a very specific agenda, it is relentlessly cited in the media as, a neutral, reputable organization that just represents taxpayers in general, which can mean anything from, me, who does precarious work, who, is paying rent and is struggling to do so, to people who, don't have to pay as much tax as they should be on, their multiple properties. So, and an example of that, and that is cited without that context. So an example, in 2009, the Taxpayers Alliance were used as a source 500 times in just 1 year in just one newspaper. So that's more than once a day. But so that's why we see, we can compare how the media essentially lost its mind when Corbyn proposed a tax system that was in touch with reality and was a fair representation of who should contribute what, to the much more tempered reaction that we are seeing now that the media has had to this tax program, which genuinely does impact working class people the most. And that has happened at the end of a context whereby when the left is seen to hold the tax system, triggers a sense that, this should be stigmatized, this is problematic. But it's not about being against the concept of tax as a whole. It's about being against certain political understandings of what tax is there to do and who it should affect. So, we have the politicians who have designed this unfair tax system on the one hand, but we also have the media and the lobbying interests that have done a huge amount over many, many, many years to lead us to this position where we can have essentially what feels like contradictory reactions to the introduction of this tax proposal versus Corbyn's, which was actually much more aligned to what everyday working class people experience.
We've got some breaking news. I told you it wouldn't be particularly exciting, but this has passed Parliament. So these plans to raise national insurance to pay for social care has been passed by 319 to 248, so a majority of 71, which isn't too different from the Conservatives' majority. I would presume that all of the yeses were the Tories and all of the noes were the other parties. I will have to check that slightly later on, but I would be very surprised if anything other than that had taken place just now. Let's go to a couple more comments. or a couple more, the first comments of the show. Mr. Full with a $5 at TLDR News did a decent video breaking this bill down, in my opinion. Thank you, Novara Media, for all the work you do and sticking up for UK workers. Yeah, I agree. TLDR can be a very good source of explainers, nice animated explainers. I haven't watched that one. Maybe I'll check it out. Bhagat Sharma with $8.99. I'm a monthly donor. Here's a bit extra on my birthday today. Novara Media keeps me sane during these tumultuous times. Thank you so much for that donation. And happy birthday. The weather, came out for you. Congratulations. Let's go straight on to our next story. We've spoken a lot about how the Tories' plan for funding social care is unfair. But is there a silver lining? Is it worth paying an unfair tax if it solves the crisis facing social care? I'd say probably yes, it would do. The problem? This unfair tax does no such thing. Francis Ryan has a great piece in The Guardian about how Boris Johnson's plan does little to solve the actual problems facing care in this country. I really recommend you read it. We'll go through the key points now. One of the big problems, she points out, refers to how or pertains to how care is currently provided. On that, Ryan writes, the mass outsourcing of social care to the private sector in recent decades is in many ways the elephant in the room. There is no point increasing government funding if the money goes to lining the pockets of private equity magnates who own our care homes and services, rather than improving care workers' wages or patients' care packages. Few could claim outsourcing brings good value or high standards. Last year, the Care Quality Commission found that 1 in 6 care providers in England were not meeting acceptable standards. It's time for a conversation about bringing more services in-house and expanding social care co-ops run by communities, and at the very least, some accountability on profits and waste. Now, this is a really important point. Many people think that social care is run in a similar way to the NHS. If you put more money into it, that will go to organisations who really care about care, who aren't just seeking to cream off profit from looking after people or saying they're looking after people, right? If this is just going to big private equity firms, they're probably not the right recipients for all of this cash. And that's not to say the cash won't make some difference, but it's just to say this doesn't seem like the most sensible, the most efficient way to spend it. You can guess why the Tories aren't going to deal with that particular issue, though. Another issue Ryan addresses is staffing. She writes, more than 70% of care workers are currently paid less than the real living wage, and a quarter are on 0-hour contracts, meaning no sick pay for back-breaking work. If Johnson is to fix care shortages, care staff must be brought into parity with their NHS colleagues, paid the living wage, and given the right to a staff contract. Now, this is talked about quite a lot in the media, the fact that care workers are chronically underpaid. It's an incredibly difficult job, and it's paid terribly. One of the worst paid jobs in the country, in fact, often at the minimum wage, nearly always, as Francis Ryan points out there, below the living wage, on low conditions, poor opportunities for career advances or training or whatever. Now, there was nothing in Johnson's plan which he said, this is the problem that for decades prime ministers have shirked. No plans as to how to make this a sector, an industry that people want to work for. Obviously, that's fair for these workers. It's also going to be good for the people who are receiving care. You will receive better care if you are receiving care from someone who is properly paid for the work they are doing. Other points raised by Francis Ryan in the piece were that the plan Boris Johnson's plan makes no reference to disabled working age adults who require social care. Services to allow people to live independent lives were decimated by austerity, and this plan does nothing for them at all. Finally, Ryan points out that Boris Johnson's plan offers nothing for unpaid carers. She writes, family carers, largely women, work around the clock and at £67 a week benefit receive less than the paltry sum given to job seekers, while many get nothing due to harsh qualifying criteria. Carers' allowance must be raised to lift carers out of poverty and outside help given for their physical and mental health. as I say, I recommend you go check out this article. Really important, because this is definitely under-discussed in the mainstream media, how this is, it's being billed as this will solve the social care crisis, which everyone has agreed we've suffered for so long. Actually, let's go through what constitutes the social care crisis point by point. And this doesn't resolve barely any of those problems. And Dalia, I want to ask you about this, because, some people might say this is conspiratorial of me, but I reckon, this is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that actually Boris Johnson's plan doesn't do anything to solve the actual crises facing social care. And I'd say it's not a coincidence because he doesn't care about the crisis facing social care. What this is it's being called a package to fix social care, when all it is in reality is a package to support inheritances to the children of the Tories' core vote, paid for, as we've discussed, by the lowest wage workers.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a serious intervention in the care crisis. And I'm so glad that article brought up the issue of unpaid care as well, because what we've seen is that, especially in times of crisis, whether that is the crisis of austerity, or it's the crisis of the pandemic, or it's the crisis of climate breakdown, it's those unpaid carers that plug the gaps, essentially, at huge physical and emotional and psychological cost to themselves. But it's actually very difficult to overstate the scale of the care crisis in this country. Part of my PhD research looks into this. I regularly interview care workers of all different kinds, and I look not only at the kinds of conditions that they're working in, but the kinds of conditions that their patients are living in because of, as you mentioned, the fact that the workers are not funded enough. There's not enough time. There's not enough. There's so much crammed into their day. There's just not enough resources put to this. I can't, explain to you like the horrors and the acute actual danger. A lot of it is actually a health threat in the conditions that some of the most, vulnerable members of our communities are living in, because they're not having their mental and physical care needs addressed. And this tax increase only takes more away from those who cannot afford to put their family members, to put their loved ones, and eventually themselves into private social care. It leaves those who already, don't really care what the state of public social care is, because they know they'll never have to rely on it. They know they'll always be able to pay a private provider of their choice. It leaves that constituency relatively unscathed, and it further cripples those who are going to have to rely on the public care infrastructure because they don't have the disposable income that means that they can put their relatives or their loved ones into, more resourced hands. Or in order to do that, they'll just incur, deeper, more predatory forms of debt, which is its own sort of form of political and social and economic control. But it's also not, a serious intervention in the care crisis because it's a drop in the ocean, essentially. And it doesn't go in to the real sources of wealth, which, is not only things, as we've mentioned, like inheritance, capital gains tax, but also like the vast amounts of globally circulating wealth that is being offshored into tax haven islands, many of which are actually under British rule. So it doesn't meet the scale of the crisis, and it doesn't even make a serious attempt to do so. But what this is essentially an insufficient attempt to look like the social care system in this country, which has long been understood to be, in absolute dire straits. It makes it look like it is being attended to. And it even, the marketing of it, it's going to appear in your payslip, not as a national insurance contribution, but it's going to appear in your payslip as a social and healthcare levy. It's a way of creating this spectacle, creating this sense that something is being done about one of the most central crises affecting Britain today. But it's being done not only inadequately, but what is being done is off the backs of young, precarious people, when these funds could be raised by much sort of fairer means. But this is essentially, and you've gestured towards this, it's essentially a political calculation, because it's another example of class warfare essentially being mediated through these generational divides. And it's being pursued in these ways because the Tories have made a calculation that young people are, to them, electorally expendable. Because, why? Because the fleeing of young people from deprived and abandoned towns that they grew up in into major cities, concentrating into very specific, geographical boundaries, means that the Tories can then just simply write these constituencies off and rely on the much more geographically dispersed older generation whose sources of wealth are much more likely to be untouched by this tax plan, but are more likely to actually be affected by the consequences of an underfunded social care system. And the great sort of irony of this to me is that, this is being introduced with the claim that it is triggered by the pandemic. This is genuine concern for our social care system in the wake of a pandemic that has basically, finished what austerity started when it comes to decimating the social care system in this country. And that very pandemic showed us the human cost of having a fragile and underfunded social care system. But the lesson that has been taken is not that. It's instead, the government is using that pandemic to make social care into a political football. And those who lose are not only those who are being regressively taxed, but as you mentioned, the people who lose are the people who need a social care system that is funded adequately and sustainably. And that's the great irony and the really sad thing about this entire thing.
We've got a couple of great comments on this topic. One saying, unpaid carers. Until my mother passed, I was one from the age of 9, following her severe disabilities, following her accident with a drunk driver. We need more attention on these people, more empathy. I absolutely agree. And also, well done for looking after your mum from the age of 9. That does sound, it's an enormous commitment, of course. And Peter Manuel says, it's important to remember care work is extremely mentally taxing, often seeing people you've built relationships with die over and over. That will be people who are working in care, which, as I say, just seems like an extraordinarily difficult and underpaid, undervalued job. On the hashtag Tysky Sour, Alex Holroyd says, the care crisis is indeed under-discussed, as Michael has just said. So why not have a disabled journalist interview on this segment? We often say this. Just because we don't have someone on the show doesn't mean we haven't asked people. So I have approached a few people. We've got a small staff on this show, so we don't always have everyone we'd like to speak to for every segment. But we will be working on these kind of things. Let's go to our final story of the day. Britain's Education Secretary is no stranger to humiliating gaffes. But today we witness one that perhaps tops all others. And that's because this wasn't just a gaffe. It was a racist gaffe. The cock-up concerned the footballer Marcus Rashford. In an interview with the Evening Standard, Williamson was asked if he'd ever met the England striker. The Standard, right. Many of Williamson's critics have been high profile, including Marcus Rashford, who called for an urgent review of free school meals. Has he met the footballer? Williamson said, we met over Zoom and he seemed incredibly engaged, compassionate and charming, but then he had to shoot off. I didn't want to be the one that was holding him back from his training. Now, on the face of it, that's quite a good answer. It makes Gavin Williamson sound very human. He engaged with Marcus Rashford, even though Marcus Rashford has been very critical of Gavin Williamson in the past. The problem, he didn't actually have a meeting with Marcus Rashford. The piece goes on. Later, Williamson's team tell me he actually met the rugby player Maro Itoje, who campaigned to bridge the digital divide, not Rashford. Wow. Marcus Rashford is one of the most recognisable faces in this country. And if you're Education Secretary, he should be especially recognisable because he's constantly speaking on issues which pertain to your job. Yet Gavin Williamson spent a whole Zoom call talking to another black sports person thinking he was Marcus Rashford. However similar they look, this would be messed up, but they don't even look similar. To show you how wild this is, I'm sure you recognise Marcus Rashford, but here he is. And there you can see on the right is Maro Itoje. He is the Saracens and England rugby player. Dalia, do these two men look alike to you?
Categorically, obviously no. But I feel like I can't really come down too hard because my own father regularly mistakes Afua Hirsch for me on the TV. So maybe it's not my place.
But not after an hour's. They'd had a conversation on Zoom, right? So this is like
my dad also.
This is like your dad was like, I spoke to Afua Hirsch this morning, and you're like, no, that was me, Dad.
No. I mean, obviously, I'm being facetious. This is actually embarrassingly common in media and political circles, and it makes me think of Ash and Pfizer being regularly mistaken for one another. It makes me think of one time when I was actually in a green room and someone that everyone here will know, who will go unnamed, decided to tell me that she thought I looked like Cardi B, which part of me is flattered, but also part of me is also like, wow, this tells us a lot about the perspective of people who make these decisions. And it's not like, this isn't like the sharpest end of racism. Like, we can kind of make a joke out of it, but it does basically show the double bind that people of color in this country are, which is that you are very hyper visible, and, you are you feel like you are sort of under scrutiny, you're under surveillance, that you have to watch what you do all the time. And yet you are somehow at the same time totally invisible. Your achievements, your individuality, who you are is like constantly overlooked. It's constantly invisible. It's constantly sort of it feels like it's just going over the head of the people who empower. And this isn't just like the point. It's not just like a mistake. And that's not the point. The point is that this is happening amongst the people. This is the attitude and the kind of the lack of recognition is from people who are at the highest level of decision making in media and politics. That has like a knock-on effect. And the fact that it feels like the people who are making those decisions that have knock-on effects on our culture, on our politics, see us but don't really see us is something that is quite viscerally felt. And I would say that, that is actually something that is quite consistently felt, obviously most significantly in Tory media and Tory politics, but actually pretty much across the spectrum. And any person of colour in Britain will tell you basically that something like this has happened to them.
I mean, as you say, mistaking people of colour is something which is incredibly racially charged, which happens all too often. This story just has another element, though, which is like, he was in a meeting with this guy, right? And also, Marcus Rashford should be someone who is really, really known to the education secretary. Like, I would assume that Gavin Williamson is really worried about Marcus Rashford because he's constantly coming out with these interventions that make Gavin Williamson look terrible. And Gavin Williamson's like, oh, it's that Marcus Rashford guy, that guy who I had that Zoom call with, who was very nice to me. Right? That it just seems like, what the hell is this guy thinking? What is he doing? Like, how unintelligent is he, to be honest? Like, to be frank, like, wow. Like, it's rude if you mistake two people who you've passed in the pub, or, if I'm going to put myself in the Tory party's shoes, who I've sort of met at the Spectator dinner party, but who I've had like an important meeting with about resources for kids, and who is also, one of the most prominent celebrities and campaigners on that issue. To think you've had a meeting with a different person, just it's wild to me. We can look at the responses from the players themselves. Marcus Rashford responded to a tweet talking about this mix-up by saying accent could have been a giveaway. Marcus Rashford is from Manchester. Itoje is from London. There was also a response from Itoje. He said, due to recent speculation, I thought it was necessary to confirm that I am not Marcus Rashford, and whilst we are here, my name is not Mario either. It's just a simple Maro Itoje will do. Much love, Maro Itoje. Dalia, do you think there'll be political consequences for this? I mean, Gavin Williamson, it's widely speculated that there is going to be a reshuffle soon, and he is tipped more than anyone to lose his job. But this is, as I say, this isn't just any old mix-up with racist undertones. This is like, it's hard to believe that this has happened.
Yeah, it's you're not doing your job, right? You're not, and whether that's, being somewhat alert in meetings, or being not racist, or being aware of the cultural moment that is happening around your role, which is Marcus Rashford is our prime minister. Remember, like, he is the one who is especially when it comes to education, when it comes to young people, is like one of the most vocal, not only critics of the government, but one of the most respected voices. And the fact that as the education minister, you are so tuned out of it that you could be talking to a completely different person for a whole hour and think, and not even, and get the identities confused. It just goes to show the kind of totally cavalier and disrespectful way in which politicians like Gavin Williamson approach the responsibilities that they are given. And that comes from a really deep sense in someone like Gavin Williamson, that even if he is, reshuffled out of his role of education minister, his political power, his economic power, his social power is ultimately going to be untouched. It's just going to be kind of metabolized into a different form, whether that's, continuing to be a Tory MP and, which is a really like powerful role, or whether it's, going through the revolving door between highly lucrative, highly powerful positions in business and industry that exists between, that sector and our political sector. So he might be at risk, but I think the cavalier and the sort of the like lack of interest comes from essentially just knowing that he will be fine always, which is not what we can say for all those young people that are, under his jurisdiction.
I mean, Gavin Williamson, if after he gets fired, he goes on to work in a very, very well-paid lobbying job, that will be the ultimate example of the revolving door, right? Because this is someone who clearly failed in every aspect of his job, clearly is not a particularly talented person, but just because he was in the cabinet in two very significant roles, actually, he was Defence Secretary before he was Education Secretary, he can presumably, I don't know, I wouldn't hire him even if I was, a very powerful boss at a lobbying firm, but I imagine someone probably will, as you say.
Yeah. Well, being able to fail up is sort of part of the social contract between like political power and economic business power. So I would be more surprised if it didn't happen.
And he's excelled at that, if that's what you're looking for. We're going to wrap up there. Dalia Gebrial, a pleasure as always.
Lovely to see you. I missed you.
I know, it's been a while, hasn't it? It's lovely to have you back.
No, I'll be back for a while now.
Amazing. I'm back in the studio at some point, I'm sure soon. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then do please go to novaramedia.com/support. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. For now, we'll be back on Friday at 7 p.m. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.